Hey guys, welcome to El Dia Opina, which translates to the day's opinion. I am Dia, the day's opinion, the little channel that gets the big names. And today we have Robert Spencer. Robert Spencer is, among other things, a blogger, a sought-after worldwide expert on radical Islam, a two-time New York Times bestseller, and as of 2003, he has founded and since directed Jihad Watch. Hello, Robert Spencer. Thank you so much for being on the show with me.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is really, really nice of you. So I'll just jump right into it, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, so my first question, do you think the problem with Islam could be its definition overall? Islam means submission, so when a Muslim does what they do, they are merely obeying Allah. Your submission must be unquestionable, but Muslims commit acts of terror, and it causes people to defend Islam and even convert. Why do you think these things happen?
Well, I suppose the problem is not so much the submission of the Muslim to Allah, but the content of the submission that Allah commands to kill. To kill them wherever you find them is 3 times in the Quran, chapter 2, verse 191, chapter 4, verse 89, and chapter 9, verse 5. And Allah also commands the Muslims to wage war against and subjugate the non-Muslims under the rule of Islamic law in chapter 9, verse 29, making them pay the jizya, the tax that the non-Muslims don't have to pay. And so this is part of submission to Allah. I think one thing that people who are not Muslim have difficulty understanding is exactly your point, that they don't really think they're doing evil. They think that when they behead unbelievers and destroy churches and this kind of thing, that they are doing righteous deeds because this is what Allah commands. And so it's a righteous act.
Yes, it's an unfortunate righteous act. However, there are so many Muslims, I've met Sunni and Shia Muslims who don't abide by this particular school of thought. So why the deep segregation between the two who clearly don't abide by those particular acts that the other more radical adherents do?
Well, certainly human nature is everywhere the same, and so human beings don't want to live at odds with everybody else generally, and don't want to be fighting and killing all the time and working to establish the rule of a religious law or any other law. People want to take care of their families and take care of their responsibilities to their own people, and that's basically what most people want to devote their lives to doing. So you have the difference between Islam and Muslims that many people gloss right over, and they think that they're exactly the same. So that if I quote something from the Quran, then that means that every Muslim is doing it. Well, you know, the Christian Bible says turn the other cheek and love your enemies. And most Christians don't do that, but that doesn't mean it's not in the book. And so the Quran says to fight the unbelievers and subjugate them under the rule of Islamic law. Most Muslims don't do that, but that doesn't mean it's not in the book. And the fact that it's in the book makes it possible for the jihadis always to make recruits among Muslims who are peaceful. And they do make those recruits on the basis of what's written in the book.
Yes. Well, should Christians start adopting this method and, just go crazy and then have people, defend Christianity and we go, oh, actually, it's not that bad because...
Well, certainly Christians would get a lot more respect if they beheaded people who offended them. Because a lot of the respect that Muslims get is not really respect, it's just cowardice.
Fear.
Like, for example, just today in the news, the German author Thilo Sarrazin had written a book, a critical commentary on the Quran, and it was scheduled to be published by Random House, the famous publisher. But Random House dropped it because they were afraid that it would inflame anti-Islam sentiment. Now, really, what they're saying there is not that they have so much respect for Islam. They certainly don't have any respect for Christianity or Judaism or any other religion.
Clearly.
And they wouldn't hesitate to publish a book that would inflame anti-Christian sentiment, for example. But they're really saying is that they know that they would be at risk if they published Thilo Sarrazin's book. They could end up with their offices bombed or people who work there being killed. It happened when Salman Rushdie's book was published, The Satanic Verses, that the Iranian regime put a fatwa out on, and so the translator of the book of the Rushdie's book into Japanese was murdered, and others were murdered. Rushdie, of course, had a price on his head, still has the price on his head, although he has not been killed, and one would hope he will not be. But in any case, the respect that Random House is showing is clearly just fear, and the respect that so many forces in the West show for Islam and Muslims is really just fear born out of the fact that they realize that terrorism is behind a lot of the Muslim complaints, that they could end up getting killed for standing against them or offending them in some way. Whereas Christians, you can offend all day and they're never going to kill you, so people feel free to offend them. I'm not recommending. Yes, I'm not recommending that Christians adopt this perspective, start killing people at all. But that is the reason why they don't get as much respect as Muslims do.
I would imagine so. Well, I mean, it's very difficult to love your enemy. I just on a personal level, when someone is being really nasty to me, I don't want to be kind to them, but I do it anyway. And it takes a lot more strength and courage to do that. And yeah. Anyway, sorry. Tangent.
No, you're quite right.
Yeah, it's very difficult. It's a lot easier to just want to hate them, but don't let hate consume you. Well, onto some theology. So as far as you are aware, who killed the prophet? Because there's so much debate about this. Many say that it was Aisha, and many say it was one of the Jewish wives. Where do you stand on this? Because I've watched a lot of your content, and I've watched a lot of content from others, and I'm confused, and I don't know where I stand on that, because there's so much division on that particular subject. The Sunnis and the Shias have different responses.
Well, yeah, the Shias say it's Aisha because they hate Aisha, because Aisha was the chief cause of the conflict between Ali, who is, of course, the champion of the Shias, the hero of the Shias, and she was his chief opponent, and so they like to say that. But there really isn't any basis for that in the Islamic traditions. It's much more likely that one of the Jewish wives killed him, because after all, you take, for example, Safiya bint Huyai. Her father and her husband were murdered by the Muslims at Khaybar, and then he took her as spoils of war and raped her on the battlefield where her father and her brother, her husband rather, had just been killed.
I remember reading that.
She's likely to have thought he was a wonderful guy. And so I think it's very possible that it could have been one of them. But we also have to be aware of the fact that the Hadith, the traditions about Muhammad, are full of anti-Jewish material. And the Jews are always the scapegoats, always evilly scheming against the Muslims in terrible ways. And so when they say that the Jews plotted to kill Muhammad, I think, well, this is just more of the anti-Semitism that's in the Hadith. We also have to remember that none of the Hadith have any historical value. We can't really know anything about Muhammad, even if he really existed at all, or if anybody who was named Muhammad had any content that we can assign to his biography, because all of the Hadith material come from a couple hundred years after, and there's just no record of it in the first century of Islam, which is very odd, that even if it was all oral tradition at that point, that nobody ever quotes to it or refers to it or ever invokes Muhammad in the first 60 years of Islam. You read the stories of the accounts of the conquered people, the Christians and the others who were conquered in North Africa and the Middle East by the Muslims in the 7th century, and they never mention that the conquerors came with a new religion or a new prophet or a new holy book. The most obvious answer to that riddle as to why that is because the prophet, holy book, and new religion had not yet been invented and came later and were cast into the 7th century.
Didn't the religion of Islam occur 600 to 700 years after the sacrifice and ascension of Jesus into heaven?
Yes.
It did. But what you're claiming now is that it conflicts with that?
No, I'm just saying that Muhammad's fictional, that's all.
Yes, well, I saw the debate between you and David Wood. I'm not particularly sure where I stand on that. It's a very good debate. I love watching debates.
Yeah, he's a very formidable debater, David.
He is. But, he's fabulous. But you both, I couldn't make out who won because you were both so strong and solid.
Oh, I clearly won. Look at the very end. It was very close until right at the end. And I won in the last 5 minutes.
And the question is, does Muhammad's existence, can we account for this gaping hole, I think we can just by understanding the Muslim sources that there was not a lot of emphasis for a lot of people on believing Muhammad. The emphasis was on. So again, we're weighing the hypotheses. One of these hypotheses makes more sense to me than the other, and so I conclude that Muhammad existed, and that would be my case for Muhammad's existence as the best explanation for all the data. Robert and I, at the end of the day, we're working with the same data. It's going to come down to what we place more emphasis on. Do we place more emphasis on having early sources? Do we place more emphasis on the principle of embarrassment? That can affect our answers a little, but we are coming down to different conclusions here. That's my case for why I believe Muhammad existed.
Okay. I don't know if you can see this coin, but it is in my book, Did Muhammad Exist? And it is a coin from Syria from the 680s. And on one side, it says Muhammad. And on the other side, it's got a picture of a ruler holding a cross. Now, anybody who knows anything about Islam knows that Muhammad is supposed to have said that Jesus will come back at the end of the world and break all crosses. And the Quran says that they did not slay him or crucify him, but it appeared so unto them. Now, why, if the early Muslims knew that Islam abhors the cross and rejects the cross and is the enemy of the cross, why would they mint coins that said Muhammad and had a cross on them? There's just no explanation for that. We can surmise that the word Muhammad was being used at that time as a title, the praised one, and being applied perhaps to Jesus or perhaps to the ruler depicted, but that it was not clearly the prophet of Islam, or there wouldn't have been a cross. Also, I'm afraid that David, for all his marvelous argumentation tonight, entangled himself in a contradiction right at the end when he said that it may be that the followers of Muhammad were simply interested in conquest and in booty, and so they didn't really care about Muhammad. And so they went out and they conquered, and they didn't talk about Muhammad. And that all makes sense. But then later, he said, after having it being drilled into them generation after generation that Muhammad is the excellent exemplar and the perfect model for human behavior, they started talking about Muhammad. Well, wait a minute. If they didn't value Muhammad, then why did they drill it into their children that they had to emulate Muhammad? And if they didn't care about what Muhammad said and did, so much so that they never mentioned him, then why did they save all this incredible proliferation of material about what Muhammad said and did, and yet never give any hint that they actually had it? I think that's far harder to believe than that Muhammad was a figure who was invented in the 8th century and the 9th century. If Muhammad existed, then the people who came out of Arabia and conquered, even if they didn't care about him, we're supposed to believe now that they put away these stories in a trunk somewhere and saved them or memorized them, but never mentioned them and never gave any hint of their existence until much later. That seems to me to be absolutely inexplicable. Why, if they saved them, would they not mention them?
Well, because
Go back.
are you talking about the phone calls? Or are you talking about the bit before the phone calls?
I don't remember actually now. It's years ago, but I remember that in our very last exchange, he opened the door and I walked through. It's just those things, you know. I don't even remember the details, but I remember that it happened because it was very exhilarating at the time. You know, it's kind of like a prize fight and winning in the 15th round after you're exhausted and it's been inconclusive up to that point. That's what it was like.
That's good.
So you can go check that out. I don't remember. It was either right near the end of when it was just him and me, or right near the question. But one of the other. It's very clear.
Yeah. You're funny. Yeah. Well, because the whole idea of Muhammad is that people believe he existed because because there is apparently evidence of it, and the way the Quran was written was not the way the Bible was written.
Existing, but they all believe there's no evidence of him existing, but they all believe he existed, and so it's important for us to know what they think he said and did because they consider it normative.
But there's 24 different Qurans.
Yeah, but the Quran, Muhammad's only mentioned 4 times by name in the Quran, and all of those mentions are inconclusive in terms of referring to any actual individual, because Muhammad itself is a title, meaning the praised one or the one who's being praised. And I wrote a book about this, Did Muhammad Exist?
I know.
That you might interested
I
in.
know. No, no, no.
Uh,
I know you wrote it. Don't worry. Trust me. I'm
in
on that.
any case,
I haven't read
uh,
it, but I've watched a lot of your content, so I'm aware that you've written a book called "Did Muhammad Exist?"
yeah, well, a lot of people, a lot of Muslims tried to make something out of that when the book came out, and they said, wait a minute, you said you wrote a biography of Muhammad before, the truth about Muhammad, and now you're flip-flopping. But
Mm.
actually, it's two different things. The content of the Islamic traditions about Muhammad is very important for non-Muslims to know because it is normative for for Muslim behavior in Islamic law. But that doesn't mean that any of it has historical value.
Mm.
And so it's two separate questions.
Mm. Well, some of my issues with the Islam overall is the inconsistencies, generally speaking, when you compare it to the Bible. For example, if I think of Gabriel the angel says in Luke chapter 1 verse 19 that I am Gabriel who stands in the presence of God. Gabriel witnessed everything that had occurred in the biblical time frame. So then all of a sudden in the Quranic time frame, he's also seen, apparently he's friends with Muhammad, and they wrote the Quran in a cave or whatever it was in a period of 23 years. But then that would mean that the death of Christ and the ascension into heaven, he saw it. He obviously knows it happened. So then Islam tries to claim that that never happened. Jesus never died on the cross for our sins because it was actually a trick. But Gabriel the angel is a witness to that. Do you think some Muslims are aware of this and they just don't want to face these inconsistencies, or do you think that because by
Muslims are very,
claiming the Quran is not accurate, they're also claiming that their other holy book, which is supposed to be the Bible because it's a predecessor, is also inaccurate. So how do you think they play these cognitive dissonant mind games?
the Quran says that the Torah and the Gospel, the Taurat and the Injil, were revealed to Moses and to Jesus respectfully.
Mm-hmm.
Respectfully.
Mm.
So you have two books
Mm.
that are not the Old Testament and the New Testament. They're the Torah and the Gospel. They say that that the Quran confirms what is written in them,
Which it
and that
does.
if Muhammad is in doubt about what's written, what's being revealed to him, he can go to those who got the book before him, which is the Jews and the Christians. That's chapter 10, verse 94 and 95 of the Quran. So the Quran assumes that there are revelations before it and calls them the Torah and the Gospel and says they're the same as the Quran. Now, the Old Testament and the New Testament are not the same as the Quran. So
No.
Islamic theology holds that the Old Testament and the New Testament are corrupted versions of the Torah and the Gospel, and that the real Torah and the Gospel are lost, that there are no copies that exist. Now, this doesn't really make any sense, because if Muhammad is referred to them to verify what he's being told, then they existed during his time. And we have copies of the Old and the New Testament from before Muhammad that are the same as what we have now. So the claim is obviously absurd.
Yeah.
But what they are saying is that the Gospel and the Torah in their original form are genuine divine revelations, and they agree with the Quran. And they say that the Jews and the Christians destroyed all the copies of them, which would have been impossible to travel all around the world in those days and destroy every copy of every book, of a single book. It couldn't have been done. But in any case, this is what they claim. And so the idea of the corruption of the Jewish and Christian scriptures is what is the basis of the Islamic claim. And they say that the Quran is the corrected version that is perfect and uncorrupted, so that you get the fullness of the truth there. And it says Jesus was not crucified. It doesn't matter if the New Testament says it. The New Testament is corrupted.
Oh, well, that's a convoluted tale, but fair enough. Are you aware of the Imam of Peace, Imam Tawhidi?
Yes, I am. I haven't met him, but I'm aware of it.
Oh, okay. Well, he's my friend, and it wasn't that long ago when he and I were talking about. When I told him that I was going to be doing an interview with you, and he smiled and he goes, "Ah, he's a formidable." Yes. Anyway, point is that he stated certain things publicly about Muhammad, that Muhammad was in fact not illiterate, whereas many claim that he was. And
yeah, the word that's used for illiterate just doesn't really mean illiterate.
Okay.
It means that he was
Dyslexic?
foreign. Yes,
Oh.
he was getting he was not versed in the Arabic language necessarily. It doesn't mean that he was illiterate necessarily.
So you
This is
agree with
something that
him
was put that
that
was
Muhammad could write and read?
yeah. Well, if there was a Muhammad,
He can write and read.
or somebody who was some of the stories were taken and folded into the Muhammad legend, some of those people or one of them could write and read certainly. The fact is, however, that if you look at the way that the biblical stories are transposed in the Quran, it's not written tradition. It's clearly oral tradition. There is no literary dependence. And so that does lend credence to the idea that whoever put the Quran together was not necessarily literate. But there's also evidence that the Quran itself is based on an Aramaic lectionary. You know, a lectionary is a collection of the sections of the Bible that are being used at various times during the year in Christian worship. And so it's all cut up into different pieces and not chronological.
It's definitely
And
not
not,
chronological. The Quran is so scattered.
yeah, and that would explain a lot of that, if that's where it comes from. But anyway, yeah, he's got certainly a good case that this illiterate claim has nothing to it.
Well, what about the claim that Aisha was not actually 9, but she was 21, and that the reason the claim is made that she was 9 is because they wanted her to come across as pure, and the purest form of a woman who can lose her virginity is at around 9. Do you agree with him on that particular claim? Because
Whoever said that,
did you not
whoever even thought about having a woman lose her virginity at the age of 9? The whole idea of that is sick to start with.
Oh, obviously.
And so the apologetic itself is desperate on its basis. But look, this is the problem with that.
So
if you go to any, what's that now?
Was she 9 or not, in your view?
Of course she was 9. Look, this is why. You go to any book of Islamic theology that's written by Muslims for Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
Go, for example, to Ulam al-Quran by Ahmad van Denver, a very helpful book. A convert to Islam, German convert to Islam, but he wrote this book about how to understand the Quran and how to understand the Hadith and how to understand how they are put together to make Islamic law. Very good book, very good, simple, clear, and basic book. Ulam al-Quran by Ahmad van Denver. And there, you go to that one, you go to any other one, and they will tell you that there are 6 canonical collections of Hadith, the reports about Muhammad, that are considered authentic. Bukhari, Muslim, An-Nasai, Tirmidhi, Dawood, what am I leaving out? And I said Nasai. I'm forgetting one of them. Bukhari, Muslim, Dawood,
I've only heard
Nasai,
of Bukhari.
Tirmidhi. Oh, and Ibn Majah. And that of those 6, 2 of them are the most reliable, Bukhari and Muslim.
Okay.
And if a Hadith collection repeats a story, if Bukhari repeats something, it's because he gets it from separate transmitters, which makes it more likely to be authentic because it's being spread around by more than one person. You see, this is the idea. Now, Bukhari says that Aisha was 6 when she was married and 9 when the marriage was consummated, or that she was raped.
Yes.
Several times, 3 or 4 times, which means he got it 3 or 4 times. So it's in the best Hadith collection, and it's repeated. That is, if it was about anything else, if you had that about praying 5 times a day or making the pilgrimage to Mecca, then nobody would question it. Everybody would say, of course, this is all authentic, and this comes straight from Muhammad and cannot be questioned. It's only because this is about Aisha being 9 that anybody says, oh, no, that couldn't have happened. And they go to much less authentic Hadith collections that nobody says are reliable. I'm talking about Islamic scholars.
But wouldn't an imam who has studied this stuff in a secret imam room, or however it works, I don't know if it's like an Illuminati thing, know secrets that you and I aren't aware of?
No, Islam is not a Gnostic religion. It doesn't have secret knowledge, or at least it's not supposed to. If Bukhari is reliable and more reliable than other collections that are not even among the 6 reliable collections, then Aisha was 9.
Okay.
And to appeal to other collections where less reliable hadiths are collected together, it's only because it embarrasses Muslims today that this is being done. And the best proof of that is the fact that Muslims themselves don't take this seriously. That you don't find Muslims arguing that Aisha was 21 or 30 or 42 or whatever in Muslim countries. You only find it argued in the West.
That's true.
Because the West says child marriage is monstrous.
Mm.
But in the Islamic world, if you look on Jihad Watch, my website, I just put up a story recently where I collected together a great many Islamic scholars from all around the world saying there is no minimum age for marriage. And because Muhammad married Aisha when she was 6 and consummated the marriage when she was 9, you can marry a girl no matter how young she is. And it's not just 1, it's not just 2, and it's not just Saudi Arabia, it's not just Yemen, it's from all over. And it's a lot of different scholars. And it's because they all know that Aisha was 9. The idea that she wasn't is just designed to fool the infidels and to make us think, oh, it's really not as bad as we think, and that doesn't really sanction child marriage. But child marriage is rampant in places like Afghanistan,
Yemen,
and Pakistan, and elsewhere in the Islamic world because of Muhammad's example. And nobody's going around saying, oh, no, she was really 19 or whatever.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I mean, I would agree with you, but when the Imam says these things, I feel like he believes what he's saying, so I don't like...
Which Imam is this?
Sorry?
Which Imam?
The Imam Muhammad Tawhidi.
Tawhidi says she was 21?
Yes, in an interview with Tommy Robinson.
How disappointing. I thought that he was more honest than that.
Well,
he
I
knows.
think I don't want to like talk against him because he's my friend, but I believe that he's coming from sources that he thinks are genuine. So I think in his mind he's being genuine.
I have explained why that is not the case.
That's okay. I'm sure he'll end up watching this.
Things, but
that's all right. I'll link this to him.
Yes.
All right. I have like a few more questions and then we'll be done. One of my when I look back at things like that happened in the 70s, in the 60s, I see that Islam was actually relatively benign and it coexisted really well with the secular world. And I look at Iran as a good example, or Egypt, and alongside the West, it seemed fine. It coexisted really well. Do you think that there's a version of Islam today that could go back to what it was like in the 70s when things were progressing there and women could wear short skirts and bikinis and all of that kind of stuff? What is your opinion?
Yeah, that could happen again, but it's not going to happen. It wasn't a version of Islam. It was a version of not Islam.
Oh.
It was the fact that Iran, for example, was not following Islamic law before the Islamic Revolution. And any other country where Afghanistan, the women were not covered, it's because they weren't applying Islamic law.
Oh.
Once they start applying Islamic law looks the same everywhere it's been applied. So the problem is that in the early part of the 20th century, actually I've written a new book about this called The History of Jihad. What's that?
Send it to me.
Yeah, it's not out yet. I'm waiting. Every day I go and camp out by the mailbox, and they haven't arrived yet, but they'll arrive any minute now.
That's all right. Email me the manuscript. It's all good.
All right. In any case, it's called The History of Jihad, and the idea of it is that, it's the history of jihad for 14 centuries all around the world. And I show that the lowest point for the jihadis in the history of Islam was the early part of the 20th century, because they were defeated everywhere. And there was a widespread idea in the Islamic world, from Ataturk in Turkey and from Reza Shah in Iran and others, that the Muslim world really should discard political Islam and adopt Western models of governance, secularism.
Yes.
And so that was very current in the Islamic world all through the 20th century. But now it's almost completely dead as an idea. And even Turkey is rapidly re-Islamizing.
Yeah.
So yeah, it could happen again if they suffer more defeats and that situation is repeated. but it's not about having a different idea of Islam. It's about having less Islam.
Okay, that's a good way to put it. I have 2 more questions and then I'll let you go. So the Quran seems to teach Muslims that they should be kind and love the Jews and but then, however, with the rule of abrogation, then
Where does it say to be kind and love the Jews?
Towards the beginning of the Quran, but then towards the end of the Quran, it's like hate people of the cross, hate the Jews. The Jews are evil.
Does it ever say be kind and love the Jews ever?
I think it does say that at the beginning.
No.
I don't have the reference here, unfortunately, but I was doing a lot of YouTubing.
I'll send you $5,000.
Sorry?
If you find it, I'll send you $5,000.
Oh my God! I'm gonna find it.
Okay.
But the point of I need that money.
I'm sorry to say, it's not coming because there is no such passage.
Okay, that's fair enough.
The Quran says in the early part, or really the later part as the book is put together, but the chronologically early part, for example, chapter 109, it says, say to the unbelievers, I don't worship what you worship, and you don't worship what I worship, and basically let's leave each other alone. And in chapter 5, verse 82, much later, it says that the Jews are the worst enemies of the Muslims.
Yes, but
and that they're under the curse of Allah, chapter 9, verse 30, and that the unbelievers are the most vile of created beings, chapter 98, verse 6. The closest it comes to saying to be kind to them is just saying, let's leave each other alone, that passage from chapter 109. You could say chapter 29, verse 46, which says that if you answer the people of the book with compelling words and so on, but it doesn't really say be kind and love them anywhere.
No, so what I was quoting, or what I was referencing, was pretty much that during the very beginning, Muhammad seemed to be under the belief that he was a prophet, and he acknowledged things like Noah's Ark, and he acknowledged the stories of the Bible, and he acknowledged that the Jews and that the Christians had the truth. But eventually he learned. Sorry, what was that?
Yeah, he said he was a prophet in the line of the Jewish prophets. But that ended up being. Did you ever see the movie Invasion of the Body Snatchers?
No. Is it good?
Yeah, it's a horror movie, and it's about how people come up and they look just like your friends, and you think they're your friends, but they're really these space aliens who have captured your friends' bodies and thrown their souls out and inhabited their bodies, and so they're really the evil, wicked aliens who are going to kill you and not your friends. And that's kind of like the Islamic version of the biblical prophets. The Quran speaks about Moses and David and Jesus and John the Baptist and so on, but it's not really the prophets as they appear in the Bible, or Jesus as he appears in the Bible. It's Invasion of the Body Snatchers version. They're all Muslim prophets. And the idea is that Abraham and Moses and David and the rest of them, they all taught Islam, and they were all Muslims. And then their followers came and twisted their teachings to create Judaism and Christianity.
Oh, I understand that. I understand that that Muhammad twisted everything. But the thing is, he seemed, this is just my analysis, and you can disagree, I probably am wrong, but my analysis to me was that he was genuine in his love of God, at least at the beginning, and then what ended up happening was he got confused, and Gabriel the angel was probably actually a demon, and what happened was a satanic possession. And
well, you know, right at the beginning,
sorry?
If you look at Bukhari, the Hadith collection, the very first Hadith is the account of Muhammad meeting the angel Gabriel, although it never says he was Gabriel. But this is the encounter that Muslims say was Gabriel with Muhammad. And you know that Gabriel, when he appears, or when angels appear in the Bible, what's the first thing they say?
Behold?
This is a test. No, be not afraid.
Oh, be not afraid. That's right. Yeah, you're right.
If an angel appeared in my room right now, in my office here, I would be afraid. And so I would appreciate it if the angel said, don't be afraid.
Yes.
But in the Bukhari Hadith, the story of Muhammad getting the revelation of the Quran, the angel Gabriel, or whoever it is, presses him so hard that he thinks he's going to die and demands that he recite, and Muhammad is absolutely terrified. And
Demonic.
so it's a very, very different spirit from the angels who come around and say, "Be not afraid."
Definitely, I would agree with that. Yeah. Well, what got you into studying Islamic scripture? Obviously, you're a Greek Orthodox Christian, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was fascinated by it because my family is from that part of the world. My grandparents were exiled from the Ottoman Empire for declining the invitation to convert to Islam.
Good on
And
you.
I wanted to know what had happened. They always spoke about how wonderful it was there, and I wanted to know what had gone on. And one thing led to another until here I am talking to you.
World leading expert.
Now I have attained
Yeah, you're awesome. Well,
heights of profession.
you're doing really well for yourself. You're definitely exposing Islam one human being at a time. So thank you so much for your time, and I'll
Thank
be
you.
waiting for that $5,000.
As soon as you send me the reference, and
Okay.
it can't be from Surah 115.
Okay. Well, I'll let
So
you go.
there's a catch to that. There's only 114 surahs anyway.
Oh, okay,
Yes.
sure. Well, I'd
Yeah.
love to talk to you again sometime, and maybe have the Mama Peace on, and have the two of you on. That'd be interesting.
That'd be fine. We'll have a debate.
About what?
Not yet.
Oh yes! Oh my God! I'm gonna link this to him.
Okay.
He'd
Tell
love
him
it.
I'm ready when he is.
I will. Okay. Bye. Thank you so much for being on.
Thank you.
Okay. See you later.